we need to do all the standard, okay. This is just an educational meeting, because we need to be educated.
You all have a set of the new regs. Town planning and
Are
zoning.
you're a new member?
Yep.
Frank Charlie Wheel?
Yeah.
I'm an alternate.
Oh, good. Welcome aboard. Ask questions. Or tell us answers. Either way is fine.
So if you start at the very beginning, which I guess is the best place to start, one of the first things that they did was they actually created, well, there's a new zoning map, and then they created 2 new zones. So at the back of the regs are, I think, did I give Jody Joy? Did I give you a reg? I don't think so.
Yes, I want to, because I have it at home. I just didn't.
Yeah, we can share it all.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
So one of the first things that they did is they created 2 new zones, which were actually rural zones. There's T1 and T2. So when you look at your map at the back of the regs, you'll see the T1s and the T2s. And T1s are basically identifying properties that the town of Woodbridge owns and separating them out as being more open space, not something that you're going to see necessarily developed. T2 includes the Fitzgerald track, but it also includes the high school and Beecher Road School. And then the Racebrook track, which is further down adjacent to Orange, which used to be part of the Regional Water Authority. So those are 2 new zones, but there's no residential uses allowed in them, but they're new to the zoning regs. Then they also renamed the 3 of the residential districts that we have, which was C, D, and B. Yeah, C, D, and BB. And so they're titled with a T3 in front of them. So T stands for transit. Nothing changed in those districts. All the uses that were there originally are there. They didn't take any uses away. They didn't add anything that was in there. And then there are normal districts that stayed there, the residential A, which is what probably 95% of the town is, and residential B. So we adopted a new map. The map's at the back, and then within that zoning table on page 3, you see that there's those 2 new districts that are in there.
So what's the difference between residential A and residential B?
They're the different sizes. So A is originally started in 1932, and it's changed the sizes of the lots over time. In 63, it went from 60,000 square feet to 65,000 square feet, and then they changed it again in 2001 on public water supply watersheds to require 2 acres of buildable land, and for the first time they introduced the idea of buildable land, where you had to have land that excluded wetlands and excluded slopes over 25%, because what they were trying to do was create lots that were actually more workable in terms of development. Not to say that somebody couldn't build on a slope if they didn't want to, but they were trying to create lots that were more workable, because we were finding we were getting lots that were just tough to develop. So they did that. And then your residential C and, okay, residential B is what they used to call Bradley Highlands, and it's down by the Brookside Market, and that was a very old subdivision. That was created before zoning, and so the lot sizes that were in there, it was its own zone because those lots had already been broken apart, and so they kept that lot size, and they've got 15,000 square feet in each lot in there. Then you have your other 3 residential zones. C is down along Landon, and that's Landon and Mettler. And that again was an old subdivision created in the 1890s. And originally it was lots that were 25 feet wide by 100 feet deep. by the time they got to zoning, they said, wait a minute, trying to build on something only 25 feet wide is tough. And so what they did is they took a minimum of 2 of those lots. So the lots that are down there have to be at least 50 feet wide by 100 feet deep, so you have a 5,000 square foot lot minimum. And then you have residential D, another old subdivision from the 1890s, only those were only 20 feet wide by 100 feet deep. So in there, it's a 4,000 square foot minimum lot size because they took to combining 2. And then the newest zone, in a sense, that was created was BB. And this is up on Lawrence Street and Roberts up in there. They're a little over 9,000 square feet. And that's because they have both public water and public sewer. So they could be smaller, but they were a little bit bigger than what was in D and C because it just gave people a little bit more elbow room. And that's all single-family residential, and that's the way it always has been, and that's the way it remains. Residential C and D has always been 1-family or 2-family, and that remains 1-family or 2-family. And then A and B, single-family residential. The biggest change in terms of residence in the zoning regs is that they introduced in these regs the concept of an in-law apartment or an accessory apartment, because they were finding many people wanting to stay in town and not being able to, they wanted to downsize but maybe have their children live with them or something. And so they introduced the concept of an in-law apartment. And that's a maximum size of 600 square feet. And it can be a standalone apartment, but it has to be in the house. It can't be in a garage. It can't be in its own separate structure. It has to be in that house, and it's a max of 600 square feet.
So if it's within the house, how does one differentiate it? One is say it's just
It could be in
with lots of rooms.
It could be a walkout basement thing where, it's downstairs with a walkout basement. It has to have the ability to be able to walk out and whatnot. And when they have bedrooms, there's also building code things about having egress windows so that, God forbid there's a fire, that you can get somebody out or somebody with a pack on their back in and whatnot. But it's a new thing. We've actually got our first one going in under that in town, but it's to allow people to hopefully stay in town and have the ability to either have a child come back and live with them or downsize themselves into the smaller unit and have their children come and live in the other part.
And what's to prevent someone from saying, well, it's my cousin from
We don't have a DNA meter, so it's not, it's not limited to,
So it's,
a relative.
So that term is just a convenient term.
It's
In fact,
actually called accessory apartment.
Okay.
So they dithered back and forth about qualifying it as an in-law apartment, but they've left it alone as an accessory apartment. And so that also lets someone who wants to stay in town have the ability to have a little bit of income to perhaps offset the cost that they have to stay here, because many people live here and don't want to necessarily leave. And so they introduced that, but, keeping it down to a small size so that you hopefully weren't going to be introducing more school children into the town, which is obviously one of the main economic factors for your tax base, because the schools are expensive in any town. So that's the big residential change within these regs, but it is a limited residential change. There had been much discussion about allowing other apartments and this, that, and the other thing. And based on the input that they got from the public, they pulled back on that, but they left the in-law apartment in there.
Are there any age restrictions?
No. And
So your in-laws can be 32 years old?
Yeah, because we're not going around with
Right, no, I understand,
yeah.
but I'm just imagining, so if there's no age limits, then that means people could conceivably, no puns intended, have children.
They could, and,
Okay.
people have lived in smaller than
right,
600
so,
square
okay.
foot things. Now, in your existing two-family zones, the C and the D, if you have a two-family residence already, you are not allowed to introduce another in-law apartment. So we don't have, in essence, a three-family
Right.
in those zones. The max they can have is 2. It gives them the flexibility if they have a one-family home and want to have a smaller unit to do it. But by no means can those two districts go anything above two-family. So that was the big residential thing.
So is this,
Good.
so that's for all
Difference.
all single-family residential in Woodbridge?
Right, so residential A, you can have an in-law apartment, residential B, you can, but they're limited in size. They're not, you're not going to take a larger home and cut it into two, bigger homes, within that large home. It's a limited size apartment. We still have people that want to have something that's bigger than 600 square feet. And what we had been doing before was saying, okay, you have to have a commonality. You can't just shut the door and turn it into an apartment. So if you want to have something that's bigger than that, you may share the living room or something, but you can't just shut a door and create that separate living space. So for people who want to have more of an area for themselves or whoever, that option is still there, but it's a single-family dwelling and it has to stand that way. So there's very specific things that Terry, as the zoning enforcement officer, looks for when he's got something like that before him. So that's the residential thing. When we went to the definition section, there were definitions that were kind of missing that we added in. I'm not going to go through them all, but we tried to add in definitions that were missing and took out definitions that didn't make sense anymore. One of the things that Terry was delighted that they did in here was they refined the definition of height of a building so that it's easier. It's not as much of a challenge when you have slopes to be able to figure out the height and whatnot. And so he's actually been meeting with different contractors that we see that do a lot of newer building in town to go over that aspect, and they've actually, looked at it, as a very positive thing for them. So that was one big thing that we added in there. And other than that, it's just going through,
Just a quick question. Yeah, I've sat on this board for a long time, and we are always doing things, zoning, obviously. But I've never heard, obviously the setbacks are going to be different in A's and B's and C's, but I've never heard any appeal that said, oh, I'm in a zone B and we're only in, 17 square feet of land, and therefore we can't, I've never heard that before. In the sense of someone coming here and saying, okay, the zoning says it has to be 100 feet from the center line of the road.
No, you've had them. Actually, that brings up another good point, because there were, within the old regs, there were 2 front yard setbacks. And we always like to say that we were very special because we didn't just have 1, we had 2. And the first one was the traditional one that you get. It's the setback from the front property line. So you have your front yard, your 2 side yards typically, and a rear yard. What we also had was a road line center setback. Right. So depending on the class of road that you had, so like 63, 69, 313, they were all state highways, and you had an extra 50 feet that we added to your front yard setback. And when they did that, by default, there were many, many houses that became non-conforming because they may have been 75 feet back, and down like on Lower Amity where it's a wider road, okay, but when Amity narrowed down into 2 regular lanes, when you added that extra 50 feet, a road right-of-way is typically only 50 feet wide total. But if you're taking it from the center line of the road, that made many buildings and structures non-conforming. Then we had major town roads. So like Baldwin Road was a major town road. There's a lot of development on Baldwin that occurred a long time ago, and the houses are close. So you recently had the one with the chimney, and that still would have come into you because it didn't have that 75-foot setback. But then they also needed an additional 40 feet from the road center line, which again, was difficult to do. So they did away with that second front yard setback. Now we only have 1, and so in residential A, it's 75 feet, and then it changes, it gets smaller as the districts go down, and whatnot. So
75 feet from the center or from the road edge?
From, not the road edge, from the property line, because more often than not, the property line sits back from the road. In newer subdivisions, typically the road is centered right on the middle of the road right-of-way, but older roads, especially Baldwin, the width of the road right-of-way meanders in and out and whatnot. So you're never coming from the pavement. You have to know where that property line is. So, so that's another thing that we did, which in a sense may take some business away from you because we don't have that second yard front back setback to deal with. So, and Terry and I had specifically said, could you please do away? Because we really didn't have a reason. I mean, sometimes you'll hear the old tales like, when they were looking at the height of residential buildings, it was 35 feet because the angle of repose of a 50-foot ladder was 35 feet. And if you were a volunteer fireman coming and needed to get up to the top of the roof, you needed that thing. And so that was one of the reasons for that, but now we have different firefighting equipment and whatnot. So anyway. So it's interesting. So that's another, thank you for bringing that up. That's another, big point that we did in taking out that one. And it just makes life simpler for people who are here. In section 3, then they went into the use table and they really looked at the old use table and they tried to get more specific with what uses are allowed where. And so, and then detail in the, you have the chart that it's at the beginning, and then it details going back and gives you more description about what each one of those uses is. And so they've added in some uses, and then they've also tried to clarify in the table what specific type of permit that you need. So if there's nothing written in on that table, it means that it's not an allowed use at all. If it's an AR, it's allowed by right. If it's an SE, it's a special exception. If it's an S, it's just a site plan review. And I think that's all we've got in there. So they tried to break it apart so that the Town Planning and Zoning Commission can get applications before it where it really wants to be able to review in depth, in particular, commercial uses, not as much residential things, but commercial uses, to be able to come in. They've also added some things in here like bed and breakfast, which we never had before, under uses, let's see, that's under lodging on page 20. So they recognize that there's Airbnbs. So we have online hospitality service, i.e. Airbnbs, no more than 4 unrelated adults. And actually, we're going to have to, that one needs to get corrected too. We're still doing Scribner errors, and that one's in here only permitted in the C, D, and BB, but I'll talk to Planning and Zoning again. We probably have to add that into A and B. We did correct bed and breakfasts, where in the copy that you have, it says by special exception in C, D, and BB. And that was something that as staff we caught, and at the last Town Planning and Zoning meeting, they did indicate that A and B also allowed bed and breakfasts, and it was just a Scribner's error. So now that I look at that, I have to make a note to myself on that one. Let's see, what else did they do in here that's bigger? That's probably the big thing that they added in there is recognizing bed and breakfasts and Airbnbs. But again, the intent is not to have it have an adverse impact on the surrounding residential character of the neighborhood. And then they've expanded the, in that section 3.3, which is use-specific conditions, they've tried to expand on what the description of those uses are. And many of the uses that are in here just carry forward, like the affordable housing areas, those are the same. But one of the things that they did expand on, which isn't really under your purview, but it's something for you to know, is excavation, removal, filling, grading, and processing of earth products. They had their consulting engineer, who was Robert Criscolo, go through and assist them in adding in more detailed information on what they actually wanted to see on those site plans and making them more environmentally conscious in terms of LID requirements, which is and also the type of erosion control that we wanted to see. So there's more specificity in that section than there used to be. And that was something that was done by an engineer, because it's an engineer that's going to be reviewing that stuff. So we did add, there's quite a few pages, on that. But pretty much everything else, Woodbridge Village District remained the same. And they've tweaked the storage sections a little bit, trying to protect people from seeing outside storage, especially in residential areas, but also in the commercial districts, so that you don't have stuff that's, when you're driving down the street, that you're looking at something that may not be as appealing curbside looking at it. Affordable housing district remain the same. They do have new provisions in here. I don't know, at some point somebody may use them for garages themselves, like structured garages, actual parking garages. You know, currently we don't have anything like that, but in the event that somebody wants to do something, we now have regs that cover that aspect of it. And I think, and then they also gave more information on site plans in terms of, on a site plan itself, what they wanted to see. They, under swimming pools and tennis courts, they specifically put in about light sources not intruding on other people's property, because that's one of the things that you don't want to have is, you know, we want full cutoff lighting so that it's coming in on a property, not going out to other people's property. And I guess that's pretty much it. So then we went to the bulk table in section 4, and we revamped how that looks too. They tried to, the intent was to make it more readily readable for people when they look at it. It's using, basically the information is still the same that we had from the old bulk table, but it's in a more user-friendly version, looking at it and being able to read it. And then this is probably a section that has more, if you want to call it changes, but they're changes dealing with down in the general business districts. You have general business, you have business and industrial, you have development 1 and development 2. And then they also touched on the residential C, D, and BB. And they created, you'll see those transect tables on page 65, 66, and 67. So they're trying to give a visual of, because the houses and the properties are so close together, they're trying to create more of an appealing village feel to it. And so they're trying to give more of a provision of what type of streetscape that they want to see. There's a listing of types of plantings that they can use. None of them are invasive. And so it's more of an attempt to make downtown, you know, become, you know, over time, it takes time to do anything. But that's what the intent of these regs are. So you'll see more information in here on how parking is supposed to be and what setbacks are supposed to be. And one of the things that they did was parking was to more formally implement, not more formally, to formally implement the idea of shared parking. As staff, Terry and I have always, when somebody's come in, you know, talked about the idea of shared parking so that you don't have an ocean of parking spaces, that, you know, you utilize the parking depending on who's there. So like if you go down to Selden Street, that parking lot is typically full, but the bowling alley, which typically has more people at night, they take up the spaces in the evening when the other businesses are done. So while cumulatively you may sit there and say, oh, between all these businesses we need all this space, the reality is that between the times that those uses are done, you really don't need that much space. We just had the Tia Russell Dance Studio, which is up on Hazel Terrace, and they've been in town over 10 years now, and they've become very successful. So they're moving over to Litchfield Turnpike. And there again, one of the things that they demonstrated there was that the other uses that are in that particular plaza are more 9 to 5, but their dance classes are more starting at like 4:30 and then going into the evening or on Saturday. So again, it's that not having an ocean of parking, but having shared parking. And so that whole thing is actually written out in here now. That was never formally in the regulations, but now it's in here, and it's something that you would provide that and show that there's a deed that lets you use something specifically, so that we can account. We don't want to have something counted 4 times if it's only actually going to be able to be used twice in a day and whatnot. So that's in there. And what else did we do in here? The signage pretty much stayed the same. It's the same. They had updated that in 2008, and so that's pretty much stayed the same. The only change that we really did in there was regarding eleemosynary signs, and if you can say that 3 times fast, go for it. That was a name that Terry actually came up with, and it means community. And so these are the signs that you see up for like the strawberry supper or something like that. We did have people who were having to file permits with us. There was no fee for them, but they filled out an application to let us know that they were putting them up and where they were putting them up. Now there's no permit involved, but they still have to meet those parameters. So they'll call us, and if we see them up longer than they're supposed to or up too far in advance, then we can call them and say, wait a minute, you can't put them out yet. But that was just to make it a little bit less onerous for the people that were doing it, but still be able to have a regulatory handle on that. So we're trying to take away a little bit of making people jump through hoops kind of a thing. But other than that, the actual, that's the only change to the sign regs that we had. So then in basic standards, again, we added in more information in terms of what we really want to see on a current application that comes before us, so that when somebody's coming in here, they can really be prepared with an application. And again, this is more for planning and zoning when somebody's coming in with a formal application to them. But it gives them far more guidance than they used to have on exactly what they want to see, rather than have it come in and then have our engineer review it and say, oh no, we need this, that, and the other thing. This way they can look at the regs and know exactly what we're going to be looking for. And again, there's a big emphasis on stormwater management. That wasn't as specifically laid out in the old regulations, but it's very specific in here on how they have to handle it. And again, that's just being mindful of the impacts of development on stormwater runoff, and whatever we have that ends up in Long Island Sound, we just don't want to have any adverse impacts that we can control up here. So there's a whole new section on that, and again, this was crafted by Bob Criscolo, who's the consulting engineer for Town Planning and Zoning and also for the Wetlands Commission. So he spent quite a bit of time doing this. He went over it with the commission, and so there was a lot of in-depth between the two of them and him as a professional. They've also added in more requirements for landscaping and screening down in the business district, again, just to make it look a little bit softened and have a little bit more curb appeal for it. They did, one of the big things that we did was, I don't know if you remember, but we had a thing where steeples were not exempt from heights. And so we had an application years back about a steeple in town. And so now we're exempting those kinds of things, so we don't have to, that's one more thing that you may not see come before you. They recognize that those are the kinds of things that typically go with a use. So those are in there. They've also provided this list of street trees, and so this is on page 91, and this is a list of trees, and they try to break it down in terms of, the heights that are there and whatnot, but these are all non-invasive, And they're all ones that, at least under our current climate, will survive. I don't think we have palm trees on here yet, so hopefully we don't. Then the other thing that they've also included in here is a provision about outdoor lighting. We never really formally addressed outdoor lighting, and now we have standards for outdoor lighting. So they're specific in here, and again, this is just something to help, the night sky and whatnot. So this is something that's updating the regulations just to be more responsible in terms of us and our effects on the environment that way. There's also requirements for sidewalks, and we never had those specifically written in here, and so they're in here. They're not up in the residential A, residential B, they're down in the areas where there would typically be more foot traffic, and again, the intent is to make it so that it becomes more of a walkable community for people who want to walk from their house to local businesses, or people who may be in the assisted living facilities or rehab facilities that are down there and they're visiting and they want to go somewhere. So that's the intent of that. Let's see, what else do we have? We actually have parking aisle widths. We never had that. People would come in and say, well, how wide is a parking space supposed to be? Well, now we can tell them how wide a parking space is supposed to be, whatnot. And then Section 6 is pretty much the same. We used to have almost 17 sections, so we've consolidated sections and tried to pull things together where they made more sense. So 6, while it's a new number, it's pretty much the same information that used to be here. This is where we have more information on actually site plan requirements, what you're submitting with that. They've expanded it a little bit, as I said, just to make sure that when people come in, that the first get-go, they can get all that information on a site plan that we need. And then you're still in here in Section 8 as Zoning Board of Appeals. Nothing has changed for you. You're all the same. And then amendments, validity, that remains the same. And then the flood hazard regulations are in here. There is one section of the flood hazard regs which deals with, there's actually variances that you can ask for, and it was interesting because when we were going through that, everybody kept wanting to shove it back into the Zoning Board of Appeals section, and I kept saying, no, this is part of the flood hazard regulations. It has to stay here, because when these regulations are adopted, they're adopted straight from FEMA, and so they have to be in the prescribed way that they're written, and so it was a little confusing for some people to read variances in the middle of flood hazard, but that's the way it is within the flood hazard regs. But those are all dictated by FEMA, so those are in there. And then the appendices regard the architectural review guidelines, which is, were always there before, and that's for down in the Woodbridge Village District, which still exists the way it was before. Woodbridge Village is an overlay of the General Business District, the B&I District, which is Business and Industrial, and Dev 1. It does not apply to any of the residential districts which are down in that area, nor does it apply to Dev 2, which is on basically the eastern side of the West River. So that was more of a manufacturing area, and they weren't as worried about, in that particular area, what things were going to look like versus Dev 1, BI, and GB, where people are driving through all the time. And so there they wanted a little bit more input in terms of architectural review. But those haven't changed. They remain the same. And that, in a nutshell, is what they took almost 2 years to do.
Wow. Thank you.
So they worked very hard on it. They did. I know it was, at some point, it was very frustrating for members of the public, watching and whatnot, but it's a process, and unless you're part of the process, you don't know the rules. It can be very frustrating because you just don't know what's going on. But in the end, I think the commission members did an excellent job of, listening to what the public had to say and really buckled down and went through them. We're still doing Scrivener errors, so if you see something when you're looking through them, I would always recommend that, when you get a chance, just, stroll through a couple of sections that are in there. If you got any questions or if something doesn't make sense to you, let us know, and whatnot. As I say, just going through tonight, there was that one that I picked up and, it's that kind of thing. And we know we're going to find those because by the end of it, it was getting a little bit interesting because Kathleen Wallace was excellent at telling us, how far in we had to indent everything. I mean, I don't want to minimize what she did. She did a lot of critical review too, but she was also making sure that these things looked right and whatnot. So, I think we have a document that works well, and it's more user-friendly for us as staff, and I think it's more user-friendly for the general public and whatnot. So, and I think we've taken away a few jobs for you that otherwise would have come to you, but in a sense, that's the way it should be. The regs should work and whatnot. So, anybody got any questions? I promised I wouldn't take too much.
That was great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's it.
Okay.
I just want to remind you all that there is a Freedom of Information session later in the month. And if you're going to go to that, if you could just let Stephanie know or let me know so I can tell Stephanie, she just would she has this fellow coming down and she wants to have more than 2 people in the room
Yeah,
and
I'm
whatnot. And it's always
definitely-
good to have a refresher on that. So, if you can make that at all, that would be terrific. And other than that, that's all I got for you.
Thank you.
Talked a lot.
Let me see what it is. Yeah, the Freedom of Information is on Wednesday, the 25th. Okay. Do you have a time on that? 6:30 to 8:30.
Great.
And that's going to be here.
Those are always to listen to because as board members or commission members, it lets you know what you can or can't do when your neighbor comes up to you and says, hey, what's happening, and what you can tell them, look, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you, and whatnot about certain things. So it's good for us as staff to go because, we listen to, you think you remember everything, but then there's stuff that you don't always remember, so it's always good for us to go to. But, Stephanie works hard to get somebody down here to go over that. And it's a convenient thing for us to be able to have it in-house so that, I know it's a night out for you guys, but, at least it's here.
Yeah, I went a few years ago. I think it's definitely worthwhile.
Yeah. So that's the scoop.
Okay, again, thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect.
And I'll let you know if you have a meeting in October or not. Right now, I don't know of any applications that are coming in, but things can change. Okay.